Welcome to the North Park Podcast, where pastors and people connect. This is the place to get to know your pastors as they address theology, ministry, and more. Join us now for today's conversation.
Hello and welcome to the North Park Podcast. My name is Luke Kiergaard, and I'm here with Pastor Luke and Pastor Zach. And in this episode, we are, in a way, piggybacking off of an episode that we did recently, the episode we did on what a worship service should look like, and kind of connecting that to this discussion. Some people might leave a church because of what the worship service looks like, and that may be for good reasons or bad reasons, and we want to talk about all of that today. So this episode is When You Should Leave Your Church. Is that a good title? I would click on
it's
that.
out there. Yeah.
Yeah. We're recording this now. I haven't released it with a title, so I can change it if you would counsel me.
No, I think it'll attract the click.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what we're all about, isn't it?
Luke, are you leaving the church?
No.
Yeah, why are you asking?
Why are you
these
asking these questions?
Depends what you guys say here. So when you should leave your church, I think we would say there are reasons that you should leave a church. For your own benefit, for the benefit of your family, maybe for the benefit of that church. But I think it's also good to maybe start talking about what are some bad reasons to leave a church. Because people leave churches all the time. I guess I don't really know the numbers on this, but it feels like people leave churches more often nowadays than they used to. Would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, like pre-COVID, I feel like I heard numbers of like 3 years, 3 to 5 years on average, which sometimes centers around the lifespan of a pastor too, or not the lifespan, but the tenure of a pastor.
Yeah.
You know, a pastor changes every 3 to 5 years, so congregation members follow. So I've heard that before COVID. I can't say currently.
Yeah. And with COVID, a lot of churches were doing live streams and recording their sermons before, but most churches adopted the live stream during COVID just out of necessity to be when people had to stay at home, to be able to offer that to people. And so, again, I don't have the numbers before me, but a lot of churches kept the live streams. Like North Park still does a live stream, and I think there's a lot of benefits to it. But with that, I think it's been a big part of making it easier than ever before to leave a church, because you can kind of quietly shop around and see what everyone else is doing, make comparisons. So I'm sure that has a big part in how so many people leave churches nowadays. But what do you guys think of when you think of bad reasons to leave a church?
Yeah, we'll try to keep this somewhat lighthearted, because I know it's a very serious thing. It's a very sobering thing, and there's often a lot of grief in it for a lot of people. Sometimes there's not. But one that comes to mind first is convenience. I'm leaving this church because this other church is simply more convenient for me. Like the time of the service, maybe like the physical parking lot, the side of town that it's on. And sometimes that's actually how God directs you and puts you in the right church. But I have seen where people will kind of shallowly say, I'm just looking for something that's more convenient for my family. There's one.
I would say being offended. Now, I'll qualify that a little bit when I get to the next question on good reasons to leave a church. But we're a collection of sinners, and sometimes someone will say something maybe out of turn or say something without knowing your story. Perhaps, the pastor is saying something that is true that you need to hear. But you've taken personal offense and then, without going through like the proper way of dealing with it, you just bail and leave, and you don't deal with the conflict in a biblical way, or, the offense that you've taken in a proper manner. Mm-hmm. That's one. Mm-hmm. That's two, I guess.
Yeah. Another, we just had did an episode not too long ago about what we value in our worship services. I think another reason people leave a church is out of pure preference of some things, preference of the music, being too loud or too slow or quiet, the sermons being too short or too long, the aesthetics. That can be another one that causes us to want to kind of envy something else. I just want something that's more relevant to me, or something that I connect with better. I've heard that several times from people visiting churches. The preference thing.
Yeah, I had that one listed as well.
The kids ministry. This other church serves my kids better, or has a kids ministry. Period.
Yeah, and so do you consider those preferences when you're you move to Fort Wayne, you come in from I don't know, Colorado, whatever. You move in here, relocating, and obviously those preferences are going to play a role in what you find in your in the church you settle in at, but. I guess I'm thinking of reasons you would leave a church is that, you've been a part of this local body for some period of time in this case. And so then to pivot away because of a preference or something like that is, so I'd agree with that one. So a different one then I would say, here's one that I've seen: to avoid legitimate church discipline. Yeah. This was a part of the first church that I was at in a full-time ministry capacity. We had some folks who had just done some sinful things, and as the elders pursued church discipline, they just jumped ship and went to different churches.
One thing I thought of was, and I do want to be careful because North Park is full of people who left a church to then come and then found North Park. But I've heard a lot of people say, not at North Park, but just in general, we were just ready for something new. I think often there's probably a lot more to it than that. But I think that's a bad reason if you're just ready for something different, but there's not really anything wrong with where you were at. I think that's kind of a wonky way to look at the church. Really, as we're starting to talk about this, we should have done an episode before about what is the church and all that implies, because whether or not you leave a church has a lot to do with what you believe about the church. So,
yeah.
Any others? Are those the main ones you thought of?
Yeah, and there's plenty more. One I have in mind is I think, and I'm guilty of this next one. Sometimes we're maybe too critical or cynical of our own church where we're at right now, to the point where we get dissatisfied and start valuing more selfish, fleshly things more than like deeper things.
Yeah,
I was thinking that can cause us to drive away, just being overly critical and cynical.
Yeah, that makes me think of like the grass is greener on the other side, where the place you're at is where you see all the problems because it's where you're at.
Yeah, and
but sometimes start to think that another church does not have those problems.
And I'm guilty of that. And sometimes there are, as we'll get into later, I think, some legitimate things that you should be critical about and concerned about. But to have an ungraceful cynicism is not healthy.
Yeah, agreed. Just a couple that I have in here, and they kind of overlap, I guess, but if your decision is an emotional response, so in whatever way that looks, and I brought up, by maybe taking an offense to something, and if you're leaving because it's an emotional response, it's probably not a good reason. And then it's very similar to that, to avoid conflict and to avoid healthy conflict resolution. I would just kind of lump those as kind of all similar, but kind of different angles on it.
I'll add one more, and this one is maybe a little closer to home for some people, because at first it doesn't seem like a bad thing, but I think it can be a bad reason to leave for a better job.
Yeah, there have been some articles out there talking about how you should prioritize your local church more than your job.
Yeah, I remember the first time I read about, and it wasn't even about moving for a job, it was about, I can't remember what book it was, but it was talking about how much you should think about when you're looking to move, even if you're moving within the city, the implications that will have on your relationship with your church family, and talking about making that decision with the counsel of your church family and maybe the elders and things. And that was convicting for me to read, because I've never really thought of it that way, but it makes sense. And again, it goes back to your theology of the church and whether or not you see the church as your family kind of thing. You need to take all that into account. But I think it's very easy to see your work life and your family life as a separate thing from your church life when they're really all meant to be intertwined to a degree.
That's good.
Okay, so now let's talk about when it might be more reasonable for someone to consider leaving a church, because there are some serious reasons when it would be the best decision to move on.
Yeah, so we'll just start with probably the biggest one. And this could look a few different ways, I guess. So I want to be graceful with this as well. But when the gospel is no longer center of the church, when Christ is no longer center of the church. And you have to be careful with this because a church might be still speaking the gospel and speaking of Christ and talking about him and singing songs about him. But when it becomes, when there's signs that the church community is not truly centered and driven towards Christ, that should be a concern to prayerfully think about still, but something to maybe start with.
Yeah, similar to that because the gospel is so central. But I would say doctrine too. Even though we talk about unity in the midst of tertiary doctrines, we had a family checking us out that was like Reformed, not Reformed Baptist, Reformed. And so they wanted me, they were asking me about infant baptism in, the Presbyterian style, not for salvation, but covenant community stuff. We did it. Yeah, we listened to our baptism episode for more on that. But, that's just not something that we're going to do. I understand it, and I can respect their convictions on it, certainly. But that's not where we are theologically, and so it's not. There are some doctrines that are worth leaving over. I think we saw a lot of churches who maybe started out more theologically sound start to lose their grip on certain theological matters that were needing to be held on to, such as like the existence of hell. Universalism had its day with like the emergent church and kind of some of the after effects of that, and it's still around there where God would never judge or punish anybody because that'd be contrary to his nature and being as a God of love. And like when that stuff starts going around where you're like you're no longer holding fast to like historic creedal points of doctrine that the church has always held to as like essential doctrines to the faith, when those things start like falling by the wayside, that's legitimate to walk away from that. The inerrancy and infallibility and inspiration of Scripture, we're going to hold on to that. And if the church starts losing that, then I think you've got grounds to move. So doctrine is worth leaving a church for. Not every doctrine, but some doctrine, yeah.
Another one, which we don't often think about, but we should, is if God is clearly calling you to something else or someplace else, even on the lay level, like God might be calling your family to a different location for something or another, or to a specific church for a specific ministry that He's wired you for as a family. Or so, if God is clearly calling you to something, that could be a positive reason to be actually sent by your current church and blessed by your current church. I've had that happen a few times. It's been really great.
Yeah, I've had that happen too. It's a sweet and beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. So I would put in there, I'm going to give two categories. This is a 2-for-1 deal, so it's a great bang for your buck. First would be abusive leadership. There's been a lot of attention given to pastors who use their power in ungodly ways to manipulate people, to control the ministry, and that is not right. And abusive pastoring, if it's tolerated and allowed to continue by the elders, then I think you got grounds to leave that. So I'll say abusive leadership. But then I'll also go and give you a second one here of bad leadership. You might not be abusive, but you're squandering church funds. You're making bad moves. You're doing things that are not good, faithful stewardship, whether it be out of ignorance or incompetence or whatever. To continue. So I think pastors are held to account to be good leaders, and if we're just draining the bank account aimlessly without safeguard and just running things into the ground, then I think that bad leadership, again, if it's not dealt with and allowed to go on, then I think that could be grounds for leaving a church too.
Those are the big hitters.
I got a couple more.
It's a lot easier to say the bad reasons than the good reasons, and I think we'll
get into
why in a
I got
minute.
more good reasons. Undealt with sin. I've seen new senior pastors brought on that got caught in stuff that wasn't right, and not like an affair, but like I've seen sermon plagiarism. I've seen just some unethical behaviors, just in for the role, and because they were newer pastors brought on, the elders at times felt they couldn't risk another transition. Like the church wouldn't survive it if we fire this guy after just bringing him on after a long search process. And so because they're afraid of going through another transition for the sake of stability, they allow sin to go undealt with. So I think that's another one. If that's happening, walk away. And then I do think that there is a place for this last one. If your family has particular needs that your current church is simply unable to minister to your family with, then I think that's legitimate. And I think it can be like a blessed thing. But, I think if you have like a severely handicapped child and there's a church that is down the road that can really help you and resource you and support you and encourage you in just like ways that, your current church is just for good practical reasons, it's just simply unable to really be helpful. I could understand that for sure.
I was going to go back really quick to bad reasons is because other people are leaving. That's not a good reason.
Yeah. And sometimes, you just start to get that ship is sinking mentality.
Yeah.
So like jump before it's under kind of thing. And you can start to have just kind of a mass exodus that is really, a lot of kind of maybe herd mentality of getting out as the thing's going down.
Yeah.
So the next thing I want to talk about, if someone believes that they have good grounds for leaving, they feel like it's something God is calling them to, or God has given them peace about it. That's just one part of it. The next part is, how do you leave the church? I think you can leave the church very poorly. There's just certain ways to go about it.
It's always hard to leave a church, no matter what the reason is, good or difficult. I think doing what you can to talk to the pastors and elders is very helpful, because more often than not, they actually want to bless you as you go. You probably won't find them that offended, actually, if you're worried about hurting their feelings or, raising up a certain issue or something like that. A lot of times I find that pastors generally want to pray for you and bless you and, see you succeed in your walk with Christ wherever you go. So I think that's really important as if the Lord's leading you somewhere, just have a good communication line with your elders and pastors. It's very helpful.
Yeah, I think in most cases, your elders and the leadership of the church should know why you left.
Yeah, so I agree with that. So some of the things I wrote down, one, don't just ghost out and disappear. I would say that it is good to talk to the pastor and elders. I think there are some pastors that want to bless on the way out. I think some do try to twist your arm to stick around and say, we're working on it, we'll fix it, And I think some people are kind of nervous that they're just going to get in this awkward conversation where they're, the pastor's going to try to either manipulate them into staying, telling them that they're not biblical for the decision that they've made, or why they should, just stick it out longer and stuff like that. And usually when the people are talking to the pastor, they've made the decision already. I think sometimes people might be coming, on rare occasion to ask for counsel. And if that's the case, I think even better. I sometimes joke when I'm talking to newer people around North Park, and I say, sometimes I probably share way too much about my personal life and everything I think about and stuff that we're working on that is, in the future. But I tell them, I say, I tend to err on oversharing because I really want you to know who we are, who I am, where we're going, and like I want you to know that as you get into this, because I want it to be the best decision for you. And so it's kind of similarly on the exit of things, like I still want what's really best for you, and I say that like acknowledging that like what's best for you might be a different place, and that might mean like some real heartache on my end, but I hope and pray that I'll still care more about you and your family than I care about like just keeping you in the place that's not best for you. And so I hope I can give impartial feedback to people, but I understand why that might be suspicious to some folks too, but I mean like I do think it's important for you to know that like your pastor, if you're at a decent church, your pastor has loved you and prayed for you and probably thinks of your face in preparing sermons and has, sacrificed in some different ways to help you and to serve your family. And that's why I think it hurts so much for pastors when people leave, because we we give of ourselves for our sheep, and so when people choose somewhere else, it gets down deep into the soul, and so that's where I think it's at least an honoring thing to do, to like say it to them, face to face and with love and hopefully tears in the eyes, that this wasn't an easy decision and this is why and whatnot. And hopefully, as Zach kind of mentioned, like there could be like just a proper, weeping together, but then blessing and laying on of the hands as you bless them as a church and send them on to whatever's next. And I think that's what it looks like at the best. So just a couple other things I would say is when to leave your church. Don't gossip and slander. Yeah, like if there was a sin issue or a leadership issue, don't gossip and don't slander on your way out. If you feel you need to make some things known for whatever reason, get some serious godly counsel first. Make sure that it's going through the right proper chain that it should be going through, and that you are above board. If you think it's like something that like shouldn't be kept in secret anymore, but I say like as a good general principle, don't gossip and slander on your way out. Yeah. You don't need to air dirty laundry as you go. Say goodbye and stay in touch, as best as you can.
Yeah.
I think another important reason to talk to your leaders about it is because you could be wrong. I was thinking specifically of like Zach started with a reason to consider leaving a church is if the gospel is no longer at the center. And then you talked about doctrine. It could be that you bring that concern to your pastor or elders or whoever, and they kind of show you how you weren't quite seeing clearly, or maybe you misinterpreted something that was said in a sermon, and that could give you clarity and save a lot of heartache. Or maybe God would use you to give them clarity and convict them, and maybe it doesn't end up in a resolution where you stay, but it could help the church down the road, maybe as kind of like a wake-up call to that leader you talked to. So you have a good reason, feel good about you don't feel, that's weird language you use. You probably don't feel good about leaving the church, but you're confident that it's God's will for you to move on. And now you need to, hopefully you realize you need to find a new church home. And I know our intended audience for this podcast is North Park people, but I think this conversation in general could maybe be helpful for future conversations they have with friends from other churches, or if they ever maybe need to help counsel someone through a situation where they need to leave a church and then find a new church. What would you guys say about how does someone find a good church? They need a new church home. How do they find a good one?
Yeah, I mean, that depends on a few things. For one, like if you're leaving the church but staying in your area, you might already know kind of the pulse of the local churches. Chances are you already have some kind of Christian network that you're part of. So I think if you're staying in the area, there's going to be some natural vetting that's already taken place. But even without that, like you want to make sure, kind of like we talked about earlier, I mean, again, like some doctrinal stuff, like does this church uphold the things of Scripture? Does it uphold who Christ is, who God is? We talk about the theological triage periodically here. Like, does this church value the things that really, really, really matter? And then, it's more secondary. But I mean, does the culture of this church do I really fit with the culture of this church? It's kind of secondary. But can I thrive in serving the gospel, serving the community, doing whatever that mission's been commissioned to do? The culture's a thing. And it's hard because these days you can get a quick glimpse of what a church might be like we said earlier. Like you can go on the church's podcast now and listen to all these great, wonderfully packaged dissertations on different subjects and say, okay, I agree with that. But then you get into the church and you're there for a month maybe. You get into some home groups, you go to a kids event, and you're like, okay, this is not the church that was advertised culturally, or who knows. So on paper, you want to check off some of those things, but you have to kind of be ready to put in some time to kind of be at places you're considering and be prayerful, be very, very prayerful, and just see what God teaches you through that.
It is easy to knock on the live stream church shopping, but at the same time, if you have a good reason to be looking for a new church, I don't know why you wouldn't
100%.
utilize that. But when you totally bank on what that shows you about the church, you miss a lot, because the church is so much more than
you need to
a
know
Sunday
what
worship
you
gathering.
need to know what the online can supply for you. I feel like I'm losing more of my voice here. The online will let you. It'll reveal the style of music, and if that's a high priority in one way or another, then like you should be checking that out. But then also you're going to learn a lot from the preaching as well, whether it's exegetical, topical, whether it's whether they're doing wild and crazy stuff, whether it seems like a big old show or not. Like you can get certain vibes that I think will be helpful to say, like, this isn't even worth my time. Like, we would be wasting Sundays to go here to check it out in person. So, I mean, but like as you guys mentioned, like you really don't get the people through online, and the people are. I mean, hey, that's our bread and butter here at North Park, is how sweet and beautiful and welcoming our people are. And so, so I would say know why you left and know what your values are in a church. If you are, have some allegiance to a particular denomination, then you're probably going to stay in that denomination. There's another podcast that may come out before this and may come out after this of 4 local pastors putting on a parenting conference, of which, North Park is one of the churches partnering. So I'm involved in that. But we were talking on the podcast as we're just kind of like, sharing about ourselves and our connection with each other. And we're working together in this parenting conference because we're all of similar faith and practice. Like we're all aligned, like in some pretty intentional ways, just naturally. And so like we just acknowledge out there that, if people leave one of our churches, they're probably going to end up at one of the other churches of one of these guys right here sitting around the circle. And so, we just kind of know that is probably going to be the case, because we have shared values that people who stuck at our church for a while probably still hold those values regardless of whatever the reason is that they're leaving. And so they're probably going to look for a church that has similar values. And so, but it's good to know those things. I would say talk to the leaders. One of my favorite things is to sit down with somebody checking out North Park. I mean, I just love it because I love just talking about it, talking about the church and sharing and things like that. But you'll get a lot of insight. Have good, well-crafted questions that are thoughtful, and you can even just Google that. Good questions to ask, a pastor at a church you're, looking at, you can find good questions.
It could be a podcast episode.
Yeah, sure could. Think about that one. So talk with the leaders. I would say do more than one Sunday. Do a couple Sundays. We had some sweet folks, some of our faithful listeners, I think, and they started. I'm not saying their names just in case they'd be shy about it, but they started coming to North Park, and they stuck around for a month, and they said, well, we're just going to stick around here for a season and just like really grab the life of this church and try to understand it. And then I think they determined, like, 2 or 3 months or something like that. And then at the end of that, they were going to go check out another church. But at the end of that 3 months, they were just like, no, this is where we want to stay. So I thought that was wise. I would say show up to a non-worship service event. So check out a Sunday, but then also try and check out something else if there's like a women's Bible study or men's Bible study or, just, anything that's going on. Like it's just a different vibe where you get to connect with people differently, and that's good. And I say, grab coffee with someone who's a member, and just talk to them about, why they chose that church, why they ended up there, how the church has ministered to them. And I think, grabbing coffee, so that's probably, a series of different things that as you're getting more serious about a particular church and settling there, that might just be collectively a good comprehensive process.
One thing I was going to ask is you might be blessed to find a new church quickly, like within a Sunday or two. I think it's most typical that it's going to be kind of a longer process, a few months or so, or who knows how long. So what encouragement could be given to someone who's kind of just in that in-between waiting period and maybe kind of hurting and lonely and just really desiring a new church family, but they're trying different places and nothing's clicking? Mm-hmm. What counsel could be given to someone who's struggling with that?
The first thing pops to my mind is come to North Park.
You haven't tried us yet.
Yeah.
It's clear.
Yeah, I mean, that's the T-ball answer for you. I would say don't allow yourself to stay in that place for too long. And at some point, you're saying, but nothing's clicking. Mm-hmm. Well, you have to be somewhere.
Yeah.
You need to be somewhere. And you ultimately need to just like pick a place. Like if you've tried every church, then you got to take one. But you can't just always, just be, but there's this problem and I don't hear, and these people didn't greet me well enough. At some point you need to plunge in and you need to take the initiative to get to know the people in the church, to be a part of it, to start giving of yourself. And I say all that with like a really cautious nuance that I want to put in there of like, I do recognize some people left their church because of some like seriously traumatic stuff. And some people were wounded on the way out. And like, there's more to the story than just I'm not making a decision on which church to go to. Like there's some stuff in there, some healing that needs to happen. And that's where, there are good churches. And I know maybe you didn't feel like it clicked, but find one that preaches the gospel, one that's faithful to the word, one that values unity and love amongst its people. And even if you didn't feel like it clicked, like get there and start to heal for a season. And that might just be what you need to do. But I can pretty assuredly say that the Lord does not want you separated from his people for very long.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been through a couple seasons of that. One was when I was much younger in my faith, so it almost doesn't count. But there's a couple helpful things that I remember. During my Bible college years, freshmen were required to visit a minimum of 6 churches before they commit to a church. And they had to give a report for every single church they visited because they didn't want students to come to this new town and all gravitate to the first thing they walked into, the first church they walked into, or they also didn't want students to all go to the same church down the block from the school's campus. So I went to 9, I think I counted 9 different churches. And then I got to the end of that and was like, okay, kind of like you're saying, like, I feel like I just need to kind of pick one at some point. So as I was kind of reviewing all my Sunday experiences, I guess, I kind of settled on, okay, at which one was God speaking to me the most from the pulpit, primarily. I can't remember the exact message. I knew it was from Daniel. I knew it was from Daniel. But this small Baptist church on the corner of town, this is out in Spokane, Washington. I just remember him speaking very specifically to whatever I was thinking of at the time, whatever was in my heart at the time, my circumstances. And I remember that would be a really clear nudge from the Lord saying, okay, God, I'm speaking to you here. And so I followed that a little bit. And that ended up being the pastor that eventually would marry my wife and I. 17 years later, we're still talking quite a bit, actually. So that was one thing that was for us. But yeah, there's seasons where it's hard, especially when you are in more of a nomadic season of life. I have a lot of sympathy for like military families. They're just always in a different spot and always out on terms for military deployments and stuff. Missionaries who come home from the mission field, they have like their home church, but they haven't really been around, and so there's like a disconnect for them. I have a lot of sympathy for them coming back home every few years, and their home culture is different, and their church culture is different. There's a new pastor in the pulpit, so I really just sympathize for families like that. But again, I find at some point you do just kind of have to trust, pray, but also just trust God is going to sustain you and point you to the right place.
I don't think either of you gave this as a good or bad reason to leave a church, but I've heard it often, and I've said it before myself, not here at North Park, but I'm just not getting fed, or I'm just not getting anything out of it. What do you guys think of that? Can that ever be a right thing to say?
Yeah.
And how could it be not a helpful way to look at things? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that can be a tough one because I've been in churches where the pastor loves the Lord, knows his Bible very, very, very well, but is not always the best communicator at the pulpit. You know what I mean? It's just hard to follow. Maybe it's too much. Maybe it's just not enough context. The illustrations are kind of awkward. I don't know. So that is tough. But you have to understand, like, getting fed is more than just the 30 minutes, 45 minutes of a sermon. Like, getting fed is just your own time in the Word. It's home groups. It's Bible studies. There's more than just the Sunday morning hour that's not the only place you get fed at.
And it's not a feeding.
Right.
You can get fed, and hopefully you do get fed.
Right.
We do want people to feast on the Word.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I resonate with that too, where I was in a particular situation where I was on staff, and there was a new pastor that got hired while I was there that preached very surface level, shallow, topical sermons. And so Lisa and I, we predated him, and the pastor before was great, awesome guy. And they just hired a guy that legitimately they were not substantial based on scripture. I could say that. And I was in a position where I was on staff. And so and as a pastor, and so I'm reading scripture, I'm preaching, I'm being fed myself. I was in school at the time working on my master's, and so I'm getting fed in a lot of different ways, just not from Sunday. But I remember Lisa kept saying, I get nothing from Sunday, and I could verify it was legitimate, and that was a really hard situation to be in. So there is that is a situation that could, come about, that did come about for us. But I do think that many times that can be used as really an excuse for probably a variety of things, of lack of spiritual disciplines, lack of legitimate, substantial Christian fellowship and accountability, probably the lack of dealing with some ongoing besetting sin. And so you have maybe this multifaceted reason to why you're not growing spiritually, and the pastor might not be the problem, or the church might not be the problem. So I think in that situation, it's probably, it has a way it could be legitimate, could be slung around as an excuse in a lot of different ways. And I think for the person saying that, I would want to sit down and have a long conversation with a lot of questions.
That's good. I think that's all I got. You guys have any final thoughts on this conversation?
I'm guessing 98% of our listeners are North Park people, and I hope that this just... I hope they have no need to listen to this podcast.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I was saying. Our intended audience is our North Park family, but there are things we can talk about that is helpful for them when they have discussions with non-North Park people. Or maybe we have some people listening who have been thinking about leaving and we just convinced them otherwise.
Nice.
We're on to you.
But if you're thinking about leaving, you can submit your reason why on the podcast. I'm just kidding. If you are considering leaving, please talk to Luke or Zach.
Don't leave our podcast.
Don't leave our podcast.
You can leave our podcast, don't leave our church.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
If you've listened this far, we're sorry.
All right. We'll be back next week with another episode, and thanks for listening to this one. And see you soon.